The gold letters on the black silk banner didn't say Happy Valentine's Day. They said, "Congratulations, Austin and Noelle." My husband's hand was locked around another woman's waist, right in the center of the lobby I'd traded my first patent to build. The sound of the crowd's cheer drowned out the wet thud of the roses hitting the floor. I stood there, watching 3 years of self-erasure shatter under the fluorescent lights of my own company. The bass from the speakers upstairs thrummed through the soles of my shoes, a rhythmic heartbeat for a party I wasn't invited to. This lobby was different now. The cheap, durable linoleum I'd picked out myself was gone, replaced by a white marble slab that felt cold and flat, like a headstone under my feet. The air smelled like window cleaner and stale coffee, a professional hollow scent that didn't belong to me anymore. A young woman sat behind the new reception desk, a sleek marble barrier that looked more like a security checkpoint. Her hair was pulled back into a bun so tight it made her scalp look polished. She didn't look up from her screen until I was standing right in front of her. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked. Her voice was bright and rehearsed, completely empty of recognition. "No," I said. My eyes stayed on that banner hanging over the staircase. "I'm his wife." The girl didn't just stop talking. She went still. That bright professional mask curdled into a look of pure horror. She didn't try to stop me when I stepped past her. She just watched me go, her mouth hanging open, as I started the climb to the 3rd floor. Each step I took on the new stone stairs sounded like a hammer hitting an anvil. Click, click, click. The music grew louder with every footfall, a frantic pop song that felt like an insult. I reached the landing, and the open office spread out before me. 40 people, maybe more, were crowded around the break room tables. Most of them were strangers' faces, hired in the shadows of my 3-year absence. And then I saw him. Austin stood in the center of the room, looking exactly like the Wharton success story I'd helped him become. He was in his Navy suit, no tie, wearing that effortless, confident smile that used to make me feel like the only person on earth. His hand was resting firmly on the waist of a woman in a black turtleneck. Noelle, our chief strategy officer. The woman I'd only ever seen in small Zoom squares during quarterly board meetings. Austin raised a champagne flute high. "To the future," he shouted, "and to the woman who's going to help me take this company to the next level." The crowd erupted. Someone whistled. Noelle leaned into him, her platinum blonde bob catching the harsh LED lights from the ceiling. I saw the ring, then a diamond the size of a postage stamp, sparkling with a cruel, cold light. I didn't realize I was moving until I was standing at the edge of the circle. The roses were crushed against my chest, the thorns finally finding purchase through my canvas jacket. I felt a sharp sting against my ribs, but I didn't flinch. Becca saw me first. She was standing by the coffee machine, a paper cup halfway to her lips. The cup hit the floor with a heavy, wet thud. It was a small sound, but it cut through the music like a gunshot. 40 pairs of eyes turned toward the door. The silence that followed was heavy enough to choke on. The pop song kept playing, singing about falling in love, but no one was dancing. Austin turned around, the glass still in his hand. The champagne tilted dangerously as his face drained of color. "Camilla," he said. "Just my name." His voice cracked right in the middle, caught between the 2 syllables. Noelle took a half step back, her hand slipping away from Austin's waist. She didn't look at me. She looked at the floor, her jaw tight, her fingers twisting that enormous ring. "The receptionist said there was a party," I said. My voice sounded flat and level, even to my own ears. It didn't sound like me. It sounded like a recording of a woman I used to know. I brought flowers. I walked to the nearest table and set the roses down right next to a tray of red velvet cupcakes. I noticed the thorns had done their work. 3 thin lines of blood were beginning to bloom on the palm of my left hand, dark and hot. I didn't wipe them away. I turned my back on the champagne, the gold letters, and the man I'd spent 15 years building a life with. I walked out the door. I didn't run. I counted every step. 1, 2, 3. 3 drops of blood fell onto the new marble floor, spaced perfectly apart, like periods at the end of a chapter. The parking lot was a sea of gray slush. I sat in my car, hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. The envelope for the Paris trip was still on the passenger seat, first-class tickets, a surprise for our 10th anniversary. I looked at the word surprise written in red ink on the front. It looked like a mockery. I reached for my phone. I didn't call Austin. I didn't call my sister. I dialed a number I hadn't called in 2 years. "Terrence," I said, when he picked up. "It's me, Camilla." Camilla Oakes. There was a long silence on the other end. "No one's called you that in a long time," the old man said, his voice gravelly. "Your father was the last one. My husband just got engaged to another woman, Terrence, at my company, in my building." I looked up at the dark windows of the 3rd floor, the building I'd signed the lease for when I only had $40,000 in the bank and a formula for industrial enzymes written on a napkin. He's celebrating it right in my office. "Are you safe, Camilla?" Terrence asked, his voice dropping. "Is Zoe safe?" "We're safe," I said. A drop of blood from my hand fell onto the beige upholstery. "I need to know what I own, Terrence. Exactly what I own." "Your father would say the same thing," Terrence replied. He breathed out a heavy sigh. "Come to my office tomorrow morning. Bring every document you have, corporate filings, share certificates, anything with your signature on it. I don't even know where half of it is," I whispered. "I signed things on my phone from hospital waiting rooms. I signed things while Zoe was in the middle of a flare." "Then we start from the beginning," Terrence said. "Your father built the foundation of that company, Camilla. He spent 6 months drafting that charter because he knew how the world worked. Let's see if the foundation is still there." I hung up the phone. 3 years ago, the world was a different place. I still remembered the exact smell of the doctor's office lemon floor wax and old magazines. Zoe was only 5 then, sitting on my lap and drawing a purple butterfly in her sketchbook. Her legs were so small they didn't even reach the edge of the chair. "Systemic lupus erythematosus," the doctor had said. "Chronic. Manageable." I only heard the word chronic. It sounded like a prison sentence. That night, Austin and I sat at the kitchen table. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that feels like a weight on your chest. He reached across the table and took my hand. His palms were warm, his grip steady. "Someone needs to be home full-time, Camilla," he'd said. "Her treatment schedule alone is going to be a full-time job. The infusions, the specialists, the physical therapy." "I know," I replied, eyes fixed on the hallway where Zoe was sleeping. "I can handle the company," Austin said, squeezing my hand. "You know I can. I've been COO for 3 years. I know the books. I know the clients. This is only temporary, just until we get her stabilized." Temporary. It was the most dangerous word in the English language. A few months, I'd thought. Maybe a year. I walked into Nova Bio the next morning and took my white lab coat off the hook behind the door. I remember the weight of it in my hand, the starch, the faint smell of acetic acid. Becca was standing by the centrifuge, her eyes red. "You're coming back, right?" she'd asked. "Of course," I said, forcing a smile I didn't feel. "Just a little while. I need to get her settled." "Promise?" Becca asked. I hadn't said the word. I just nodded and walked out. I didn't know then that Austin would change the locks 4 months later. I didn't know that standard quarterly updates would turn into documents that stripped away my voting rights. I only knew that my daughter needed me. I looked down at the kitchen table where Zoe had been drawing earlier that day. She'd left a picture of the Nova Bio building. She'd colored the windows bright yellow and written Mommy's Building across the top in messy, uneven letters. She'd spelled building wrong, leaving out the second I. I'd taken that drawing and taped it to the refrigerator. It was still there. 3 years later, the edges yellowing and the tape starting to peel. Every time I looked at it, I felt a pang of guilt. I'd told myself I was doing the right thing. I was being the mother she needed. But sitting in my car on Valentine's Day, watching the snow start to fall on the windshield, I realized I was wrong. Being a good mother didn't mean I had to be a ghost. My phone buzzed in the cup holder. Austin. Again. This was the 12th time he'd called in 20 minutes. I watched the screen glow, his name flickering in the dark. Austin Yates. I let it go to voicemail. I didn't want to hear his excuses. I didn't want to hear him tell me he could explain, or that Noelle was just a mistake. I knew what his love looked like now. It looked like a diamond ring bought with my money and a banner hung in my office. I started the engine. The snow was falling heavier now, covering the parking lot in a white blanket. Austin's name lit up on my phone again. The 23rd call. I watched it ring until the screen went dark. Austin thought I was just a nurse who had forgotten how to count. He thought that because I had stepped out of the room, I had given up my seat at the table. He was about to find out how wrong he was. I pulled out of the lot and drove toward home. In the rearview mirror, the dark windows of Nova Bio's 3rd floor still glowed with the light of a party I wasn't invited to. Somewhere in that building, my name had been scrubbed from the walls, my lab coat replaced by champagne flutes and engagement rings. But my father had always told me that a building belongs to the person who poured its foundation, not the person who changed the paint. Tomorrow, I would find out if the foundation was still there. The house was finally quiet. The kind of silence that feels heavy and thick after a long day of managing a child's chronic pain. Zoe was tucked in upstairs, her breathing steady for once, but I could not bring myself to sleep. I sat in my small home office, the blue glow of the laptop screen the only thing illuminating the dark room. Outside, the Boston suburbs were buried in a deep, midnight hush, and a light snow began to dust the windowsill. I opened the browser and navigated to the Delaware corporate records. My hands were steady, but my mind was a storm of chemical equations and shifting corporate structures. I found the filing from 4 months ago. It was a board resolution, buried under a dozen routine administrative updates that usually went straight to the archive. My stomach turned as I read the numbers on the screen. The board had issued 200,000 new shares of Class B stock to a group of key executives. On paper, my 830,000 Class A shares, the ones I had worked 18 hours a day to earn while my daughter was a toddler, suddenly looked small. My voting power had been slashed from 83% to exactly 41%. I was no longer the majority. I was being erased from the very company I had built with my own 2 hands. I scrolled down to the signatures at the bottom of the document. Austin Yates, Chief Executive Officer. Noelle Rains, Chief Strategy Officer. And a third name I did not recognize, Hank Moretti, Independent Director. I wondered who Hank Moretti was and when he had been appointed to my board. A single line at the end of the filing felt like a physical blow to my chest. It stated that founder approval had been waived per a Section 7.2 amendment. I leaned back in my chair, the leather creaking in the silence. I had no memory of ever signing an amendment to Section 7.2. For 3 years, Austin had sent me digital documents twice a month, always claiming they were standard quarterly filings or insurance renewals. I had signed them from hospital waiting rooms or Zoe's bedside at 3 a.m. My eyes blurred with exhaustion and my heart heavy with worry. I had never read the fine print. I had trusted him with the company, because I was too busy trying to keep our daughter alive. I realized then that every one of those hurried signatures might have been a permission slip for him to steal my life's work. The next morning, the air in Terrence's office smelled like old paper, lemon oil, and the faint, sweet scent of the pipe tobacco my father used to prefer. Terrence sat behind a wide oak desk that was piled high with legal folders, a portrait of my father hanging on the wall directly behind him. He did not waste time with small talk or false sympathy. He pulled a thick, yellowed document from a drawer and pushed it across the dark wood toward me. It was the original Articles of Incorporation from 2017. Terrence pointed to a specific paragraph with a gnarled finger and told me to read Article 4, Section 3. I leaned in, my heart thudding against my ribs like a trapped bird. The clause was written in my father's precise, unwavering hand. It stated that any issuance of equity securities that did not have the express written consent of the Class A majority holder would be void from the very beginning. It went even further, giving the Class A majority holder the right to force a buyback of all those unauthorized shares for exactly $1 each. $1, I whispered, the weight of the words sinking in. Terrence nodded slowly. He took off his glasses and cleaned them with a small silk cloth. He told me that for Austin's 120,000 shares, it would only cost me $120,000 to take them back. For Noel's 60,000 shares, it would be $60,000. The total cost to reclaim my company would be $200,000 for shares they currently valued at $12 million. He told me my father had written that clause himself and had called it the nuclear option. I remembered my father sitting at our kitchen table years ago, telling me I would thank him for being precise one day. I had called him paranoid and told him he was being too hard on Austin. He had looked me in the eye and told me he was just being careful because he knew how the world worked. He had seen this coming before I even knew Austin Yates existed. But there was a complication. Terrence warned me that Austin's legal team had filed an amendment to Section 7.2, which supposedly allowed the board to issue shares without my consent. If that amendment was legally binding, the Founders Clause might be useless in court. My chest tightened as I thought about all those digital documents I had signed without a second thought. Terrence held up a hand, a small, knowing smile touching his lips. He told me that my father had been even smarter than that. He pointed to Section 12.1 of the Charter. Any amendment to the core articles of the company required a supermajority vote of 75% of the outstanding shares. Since I held 83%, no amendment could ever legally pass without my specific vote as a shareholder. A digital signature on a board update was not enough. I felt the first real breath of air in 48 hours enter my lungs. The fortress my father had built for me was still standing. By that evening, I was back in my kitchen, the smell of burnt coffee and lavender oil lingering in the air. Becca arrived at the back door, her face flushed red from the biting Massachusetts wind. She did not say a word as she stepped inside and placed a heavy, black binder on the granite counter. It hit the surface with a loud thud that seemed to echo through the empty house. I noticed a dozen colorful sticky tabs sticking out from the edges, yellow, green, and red. Zoe was upstairs, the quiet scratching of her colored pencils against paper, the only sound coming from the second floor. Becca looked like she had not slept in weeks. She told me she had started keeping the binder 14 months ago when the first invoice from a new vendor did not make sense. I opened the first yellow tab and saw an invoice from a company called Rains Strategic Partners, LLC. It was for $180,000 for enzyme optimization consulting. I felt a surge of cold fury. We did all our enzyme research and optimization in-house. Becca pointed out that she ran that department and that no one from this outside company had ever set foot in her lab. I flipped to the green tabs. 4 major research and development contracts, worth a total of $1,400,000. had been redirected from Nova Bio to that same LLC in less than a year. My company was being bled dry, and the money was flowing straight into a shell company owned by Noel Raines. Then Becca pointed to the red tabs. Noel had been hired 18 months ago with a starting salary of $285,000. There was a signing bonus of $50,000 and a relocation package of $30,000. Relocation from where? I asked, my voice barely audible above the hum of the refrigerator. Becca told me she had moved from Cambridge, only 8 miles away. She had been paid $30,000 of my company's money to move 8 miles down the road. I closed the binder, my hands resting on the cool plastic cover. I realized then that this was not just an affair between my husband and his coworker. This was a systematic theft of the company I had founded in a garage while I was pregnant with Zoe. They had used my daughter's illness as a cover, assuming I was too broken and too distracted to ever look at the books again. I felt the pain in my chest shift and harden. The hurt was still there, but it was being pushed aside by a cold, calculating math. I looked at the binder, and then at my phone, which was buzzing with yet another missed call from Austin. I did not feel the need to cry anymore. I looked at the 83% I still owned and the $1 per share buyback price. I thought about the $1,400,000 they had siphoned away. The numbers were clear, and for the first time in 3 years, I knew exactly what I had to do. I was no longer a mother on an indefinite leave of absence. I was the majority shareholder, and I was coming to collect everything they owed me. The mahogany surface of Terrence's desk was the only thing that felt solid in a world that had become a blur of betrayal and cold realization. It was a massive, scarred piece of furniture that smelled of lemon oil and decades of hard decisions. Between us sat the black binder Becca had delivered, its colorful plastic tabs looking like small, defiant flags in a battlefield of paper. We had spent the last 2 hours pulling the digital footprints of my life, DocuSign records that I had barely glanced at over the last 3 years. The trail was even uglier than I expected. Terrence leaned back, his leather chair letting out a long, weary groan that seemed to echo my own exhaustion. He told me that the system showed a specific record of the Section 7.2 amendment. It had been sent to my personal email address at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night 8 months ago. I closed my eyes and searched my memory. 8 months ago. That was the week Zoe had her first major flare-up after the medication change. I had been in a windowless room at Mass General, watching a heart monitor and praying for her fever to break. The DocuSign record showed my signature at 2:47 in the morning. I must have clicked through it from Zoe's bedside, half asleep, while an IV drip counted the seconds of my daughter's recovery. I had signed it without reading a single word. The document was titled Board Governance Update, 6 pages of boilerplate with a single, buried paragraph on page 5 that handed the board authority to issue new shares without my consent. It was not a forgery. It was something worse, a trap designed to look routine. Sent at the exact hour when Austin knew I would be too exhausted and too afraid for my daughter to read the fine print. Terrence took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He told me that I had reached a fork in the road, and the choice I made now would define the next decade of my life. He said I could confront Austin privately, try to negotiate a quiet exit that would leave me with some dignity and a fraction of my money. Or I could invoke the Founders Clause directly, sending a formal notice to the board that would trigger a mandatory buyback of every unauthorized share. The third option, he said, was the scorched earth policy. We could file in court immediately an emergency injunction to freeze the private equity deal, followed by a full fraud complaint and a lawsuit for breach of fiduciary duty. He looked at me with an intensity that made my throat tighten. He asked me what my father, Raymond Oakes, would have done. I didn't have to think about it. I remembered my father sitting at our old kitchen table, his eyes sharp behind his reading glasses, telling me that a man who steals a penny will eventually steal the house, if you let him. I looked at Terrence and asked him what the rule was for dealing with people who had already proven they would lie to my face. Terrence gave me a small, grim smile. He told me that my father's rule was as old as the law itself. He said you never negotiate with a thief, because a thief only negotiates to buy more time. He said we litigate. I want the scorched earth, I said. My voice was low, but it didn't tremble. I told him I didn't want a compromise that would leave me wondering if I still had a company left. But I told him I needed to be precise. I wanted a forensic audit to find every single dollar they had siphoned into Noel's shell company before we ever stepped foot in a courtroom. I wanted the math to be so clear that a judge wouldn't have to think twice. Terrence nodded and reached for his desk phone. He told me he was calling Priya Nair. He said she was a forensic accountant who had spent 12 years sniffing out money laundering for the big firms before she got tired of the corporate politics. He said she was a bloodhound in a silk suit, and she worked faster than anyone in the city. Reaching into my bag for my checkbook felt like reaching for a weapon. The leather was worn and soft, stained with a few drops of juice from a box I'd opened for Zoe months ago. I opened it to the back and wrote out a check for $15,000. That money wasn't from the joint account. It was from the patent royalties I had earned before I ever married Austin Yates, money I had kept in a separate account because my father had insisted on it. I had felt guilty about that secret account for years, thinking it meant I didn't fully trust my husband. Now, as I pressed the pen into the paper, I realized my father hadn't been cynical. He had been right. I handed the check to Terrence. It felt heavier than a piece of paper. This was the first time in 3 years I was spending a significant amount of money on something that wasn't a hospital bill or a specialist's consultation fee. I was spending it on myself. I was buying my own voice back. 2 days later, the morning air was a biting, gray chill as I walked toward a small coffee shop 3 blocks from the Nova Bio building. I chose a place that was too loud and too crowded for Austin's executive team to ever frequent. Becca was already there, tucked into a corner booth, her hands wrapped around a steaming paper cup. She looked like she had been looking over her shoulder since we last spoke. She told me that the atmosphere inside the building was getting stranger. She mentioned that Jenny in accounting had been pulled into Austin's office twice this week. Jenny had been asked to backdate 3 invoices for Rain's strategic partners. And when she questioned them, Noel had told her that it was a routine adjustment for the upcoming audit. Becca also mentioned Marcus in IT. He had discovered that Noel had requested a complete mirror of the R&D server onto a private cloud account that wasn't part of the company's encrypted backup system. They're preparing to move the intellectual property, I said. The coffee in my cup tasted like burnt plastic, but I drank it anyway. I asked her if anyone was asking about me. Becca looked down at her coffee. She told me that Austin had finished the rebrand of the company website yesterday afternoon. She said the About Us page now looked like I never existed. The company history started in 2019, the year Austin took over as acting CEO. My name wasn't in the founders section. My face wasn't in the archives. It was as if the years I spent sleeping on a cot in the lab had been wiped clean by a web designer's mouse click. Jenny had even asked Becca if I had been a consultant who left on bad terms, because that was the rumor being whispered in the hallways. A ghost, I whispered. That's what they've turned me into. My phone buzzed on the scratched wooden table. It was a text from Austin. Camilla, please. I know you're upset. I can explain everything if you just come over tonight. It's not what it looked like. Noel is just helping me navigate the PE deal. We're a team, babe. Don't throw away everything we've built because of a misunderstanding. I looked at the word misunderstanding until it blurred. I thought about the champagne toast. I thought about his hand on her waist. I thought about the $30,000 he paid her to move 8 miles. I took a screenshot of the message and sent it to Terrence without a word. Then, I blocked Austin's number. I told Becca that I was done being a ghost. I told her that if they wanted a haunting, I was going to give them one they would never forget. I left the coffee shop and drove out to the industrial district, where the warehouses were tall, gray monoliths against the winter sky. The storage facility was a maze of corrugated metal and flickering security lights. I hadn't been to Unit 412 in 6 years. The lock was stiff with rust, and I had to put my shoulder into the door to get it to slide upward. The groan of the metal was the loudest thing in the quiet morning. Inside, the air was still and smelled of cedar and the heavy, comforting scent of my father's old law library. I started moving boxes, my breath coming in white puffs of steam. I found the one labeled Personal and Corporate Formation. I pulled it down and set it on a stack of old chairs. Beneath it was a smaller box, wrapped in brown paper and labeled with my name in my father's thick, unmistakable handwriting. Inside that smaller box were the original share certificates, still crisp and smelling of the bank vault where they had been born. But there was also a thick, white envelope. It was sealed with a piece of tape that had turned yellow with age. On the front, my father had written, "For Camilla, when they think you are no longer looking." I sat on the edge of a crate and opened it. The letter inside was 3 pages long, written on his firm's heavy stationery. The date at the top was from the month I had incorporated Nova Bio. "My dearest Camilla," the letter began, "you are currently sitting in a garage, surrounded by beakers and dreams. And you believe that the people you love will always be as honest as you are. I hope I am wrong, but 40 years of practicing law has taught me that success brings out a specific kind of hunger in people. They will see what you have built, and they will want it. They will tell you that you are too emotional, or too tired, or too busy with your family to handle the heavy lifting. They will try to convince you that your absence means your ownership has expired." I felt a tear slip down my cheek, cold and wet. I wiped it away with the back of my hand. I wrote Article 4, Section 3 for a reason. Camilla, I didn't tell you the full extent of its power because I wanted you to build your company on trust. But if you are reading this, it means that trust has been broken. Read the language carefully. It is a mandatory buyback at par value. It doesn't matter what the market says the company is worth. It only matters what the charter says. If they dilute you without your written consent, you have the right to take it all back for the price of a few used cars. Use it. Don't feel guilty. You aren't destroying them. They destroyed the agreement. You are simply reclaiming the foundation. The letter ended with a sentence that made my heart stop. And remember, my girl, you never have to choose between being a mother and being a founder. You are the only person I know who is strong enough to be both. Don't let them tell you otherwise. I folded the paper and tucked it back into the envelope. I sat in the dim light of the storage unit for a long time, listening to the wind whistle through the gaps in the metal door. The guilt that had been eating at me for 3 years, the feeling that I had abandoned my company to save my daughter started to lift. It was replaced by something harder and colder. Austin had bet everything on the idea that I was just a mother now. He thought that motherhood had softened my brain and dulled my edge. He thought that because I had spent 3 years in hospital rooms, I had forgotten how to fight for the world I had built before Zoe was even a thought in my mind. He was about to find out that a mother fighting for her daughter's legacy is the most dangerous person on the planet. I spent the rest of the afternoon at Priya Nair's office. It was a glass-walled space in the Seaport district, filled with whiteboards and monitors displaying complex flowcharts of money. Priya was exactly as Terrence had described, sharp, clinical, and completely unimpressed by corporate titles. She had already pulled the preliminary filings for Rain's Strategic Partners LLC. She told me that the shell company was a disaster waiting to happen. She had traced the $1,400,000 in R&D contracts to a personal checking account at a Boston bank that had been opened in Noelle's name only 3 days after she was hired at Nova Bio. She also found a series of payments totaling $85,000 to a man named Hank Moretti. I recognized the name. He was the independent director on our board, the man Austin had appointed 8 months ago to serve as the company's ethical guardrail. She said the payments were disguised as strategic advisory fees. But the timing lined up perfectly with board votes that approved the share dilution and the private equity deal. It was a kickback, plain and simple. Priya looked at me and nodded. She told me it was a textbook case of self-dealing. She said that if we could prove that Hank Moretti took money from Noel's LLC while he was voting on board resolutions, the entire private equity deal was not just unethical. It was criminal. 2 of the 3 board members had direct financial conflicts of interest. The governance of my company had been hijacked from the inside. I stood up and looked out the window at the harbor. The water was dark and choppy, reflecting the steel gray sky. I told Priya I wanted every document, every bank statement, and every email. I told her I wanted the evidence to be so overwhelming that they wouldn't even be able to look me in the eye. The threshold was behind me. I had walked through the door, and I wasn't going back. I wasn't the woman who brought roses to a betrayal anymore. I was the woman who was going to take back the keys to the kingdom. I drove home as the sun was setting, the sky a bruised purple over the highway. When I walked through the front door, the house smelled like the lavender oil I used to help Zoe sleep. She was sitting at the kitchen table, drawing in her sketchbook. She looked up and smiled at me, her face pale but her eyes bright. "Mom, you're home late," she said. "I am, baby," I replied. I walked over and kissed the top of her head. I noticed what she was drawing. It was the Nova Bio building again, but this time there was a tiny figure standing on the roof, wearing a white lab coat and holding a sword. "Who is that?" I asked. Zoe looked at the drawing and then back at me. "That's you. Mom, you're protecting the building from the monsters." I felt a lump form in my throat, but I forced it down. I sat down next to her and took her small, cool hand in mine. I told her she was right. I told her the monsters were real, but they had made a very big mistake. They had forgotten who the building belonged to. That night, I didn't dream of hospital rooms or sick beds. I dreamed of a garage with a concrete floor and the smell of ozone. I dreamed of the first time I saw an enzyme react exactly the way I had predicted, and when I woke up at 4 a.m, I didn't feel tired. I felt ready. I sat at my desk and opened my laptop. I started a new document. I didn't label it as a mother's diary or a medical log. I labeled it Nova Bio Recovery Plan, Phase 1. The fight was no longer about the affair. It was no longer about the diamond ring or the red velvet cupcakes. It was about the name on the door. It was about the 83% that Austin Yates thought he could talk his way out of. I looked at the photo of my father on the corner of my desk. He was smiling, his hand on my shoulder on the day I graduated from MIT. I told him, silently, that I was going to be both. I was going to be the mother Zoe deserved, and I was going to be the CEO that Nova Bio needed. And Austin was going to be the man who watched it all happen from the outside of a locked door. The first week of March arrived with a gray, relentless rain that seemed to soak into the very bones of the city. I spent my mornings in the quiet, sterile rhythm of our home, tracking Zoe's temperature and ensuring her joints were wrapped in warm compresses. But my mind was perpetually 3 miles away in the Seaport District. I was living a double life. To my daughter, I was the mother who made perfect grilled cheese and read stories until the fever broke. To Priya Nair, I was a ghost returning to reclaim a haunted house. When Priya finally called me into her office to review the completed forensic audit, the atmosphere felt different. It was no longer about suspicions. It was about the cold, hard weight of proof. Her office was a glass-walled box that overlooked the dark, choppy waters of the harbor, filled with the hum of high-end servers and the scent of expensive green tea. Priya sat behind a desk that was meticulously organized, holding a digital tablet that contained the blueprint of my husband's betrayal. She didn't start with small talk. She tapped the screen, and a flowchart appeared on the wall monitor. A web of red lines connecting Nova Bio to an entity called Rains Strategic Partners Limited Liability Company. Priya explained that this shell company had been incorporated in Delaware exactly 11 months ago, with Noel Rains listed as the sole member. My eyes traced the red lines. There were 4 specific research and development contracts, projects I had pioneered and patented, that had been diverted from Nova Bio into this LLC. The total value of those contracts was $1,400,000. I felt a sharp, icy needle of breath catch in my throat. That was money meant for laboratory equipment, for scientists' salaries, for the future of the company I had built from a garage. Instead, it had been siphoned off while I was sitting in a hospital chair, distracted by my daughter's pain. I realized then that every time Austin had complained about the high cost of Zoe's treatments or the tightening of the company's budget, he had been lying. The money was there. He was just giving it to her. But Priya wasn't finished. She tapped the screen again, highlighting a series of payments totaling $85,000. This money didn't go to Noel. It went to a personal account belonging to Hank Moretti. I recognized the name instantly. Hank was our independent director, the man who was supposed to be the ethical guardrail of the board. He was the one who had hugged me at our 5-year anniversary party and told me my father would be proud. Priya explained that Noel's LLC had categorized these as strategic advisory services. In reality, it was a bribe. By paying Hank, Austin and Noel had bought his vote to approve the unauthorized share dilution and the upcoming private equity deal. Terrence had been right. This wasn't just a corporate dispute. It was a criminal conspiracy. The vote was voidable on 2 grounds now: the violation of my founder's clause and a massive, undeniable breach of fiduciary duty. I sat back in the leather chair, my hands resting on my knees to keep them from shaking. I felt a strange, detached kind of clarity. It was as if the emotional pain of the affair was being overwritten by the mathematical certainty of the theft. Priya then pushed a single, physical sheet of paper across the desk. It was an invoice for $3,200. The description read, Executive Cohesion Workshop. It was for a 2-night stay at a luxury resort in Napa Valley, specifically for a king-sized suite. I actually laughed, a short, jagged sound that had no humor in it. I told Priya that I had seen a lot of creative accounting in my career, but executive cohesion was a masterpiece of irony. It was the king-sized bed that did it. That detail made the betrayal feel small and dirty, a stark contrast to the millions of dollars they were moving behind the scenes. Priya didn't smile, but her eyes held a cold kind of satisfaction. She informed me that she had traced a total dissipation of marital assets to affair-related spending that totaled $214,000. That was the price of their weekend getaways, the jewelry Noel wore in the office, and the relocation package Austin had paid her to move exactly 8 miles down the road. I left her office and drove home in a trance of cold fury. By the time I reached the house, the sun was setting in a pale wash of purple and orange. I found Zoe on the sofa, her sketchbook open as she watched a nature documentary. I went into the kitchen to start dinner, the domestic routine acting as a thin veil over the war I was preparing to wage. As I was stirring a pot on the stove, Zoe's phone rang. It was a FaceTime call from her grandmother, Diane. Zoe answered it on speaker, and Diane's voice filled the kitchen bright, performative, and thick with the artificial sweetness she had used on me for nearly a decade. She asked about Zoe's day, her drawings, and her health, playing the part of the doting grandmother to perfection. Then, she asked if Austin was home. Zoe, with the brutal honesty of an 8-year-old, told her that Daddy didn't come home much anymore. There was a long, heavy pause. On the other end of the line, I stood perfectly still, the wooden spoon in my hand, listening to the silence of the woman who had called me her daughter after my own mother passed away. When Diane spoke again, her voice had shifted. It was lower, intimate, and stripped of the grandmotherly facade. She told Zoe that her father was very busy at work because he was doing amazing things and that Grandma was so proud of him. Mom built the company, though, Zoe said, her voice small but firm. I heard Diane let out a sharp, dismissive breath. She told Zoe that while that might be true, her father was the one running it now, and that was what mattered. Then, in a voice she clearly thought was too low for me to hear, she whispered that Austin finally had a partner who matched his ambition. A partner who wasn't constantly distracted. I felt the grip of the spoon tighten until the wood bit into my palm. A partner who matches him. Diane didn't just know about the affair, she had blessed it. She saw my sacrifice, my choice to step back and save her granddaughter's life, as a weakness. To her, I was no longer the brilliant scientist who had founded Nova Bio. I was just a distracted mother who had become an anchor around her son's neck. I didn't interrupt the call. I waited until Zoe said goodbye and went back to her drawing. Then, I walked into the bathroom, turned on the cold water, and splashed my face until my skin went numb. The betrayal was complete. It wasn't just Austin and Noelle. It was the board, the independent directors, and even the family I had thought was mine. I was completely alone. But for the first time, that thought didn't terrify me. It made me dangerous. The next morning, I was in Terrence's office before he had even finished his first cup of coffee. I told him I was done gathering evidence. I wanted to move. Terrence didn't argue. He had the documents ready. He had spent the night finalizing the emergency motion for the Suffolk County Superior Court. We were filing for an ex parte temporary restraining order. Our primary goal was to freeze the private equity deal with Alderton Capital, which was scheduled to close in less than 2 weeks. We argued that if the deal closed, the unauthorized share dilution would become permanent, and the majority shareholder, me, would suffer irreparable harm. Terrence also filed a motion for a preliminary injunction hearing, which the court scheduled for 3 weeks later. Along with the freeze on the deal, we filed a formal fraud complaint against Noelle Rains and her shell company, a lawsuit for breach of fiduciary duty against Austin and Hank Moretti, and a notice of the Founders Clause invocation. We were officially demanding a mandatory buyback of every single Class B share for exactly $1 each. Austin was served at the Nova Bio office at 11 o'clock that morning. Noelle was served at her home an hour later. Terrence called me to confirm the service, his voice carrying a note of grim triumph. He told me that Austin's attorney had called within 30 minutes, sounding frantic and wanting to discuss a settlement. I asked Terrence what he told them. He said he had delivered the message we had agreed upon. We do not negotiate with people who treat a corporate charter like a suggestion. An hour later, my phone began to vibrate in the cup holder of my car. I had blocked Austin's personal number, but he was calling from a line I didn't recognize. I pulled over into a parking lot, my heart beating with a cold, steady rhythm. I answered the call. "Camilla, please," he said. His voice was breathless, a mix of panic and the practiced charm he used on investors. "This is insane. You are going to destroy the company. We can work this out. We are a team. Think about what we have built." I looked out at the rain-slicked pavement and felt nothing but a vast, empty space where my love for him used to live. I told him that he was right about one thing. We were going to work it out, but we weren't going to do it over dinner or in a mediation room. We were going to do it in front of a judge. I told him that he had spent 3 years calling me a nurse and a caregiver as if those were insults. I told him that a nurse knows how to stop a bleed, and a caregiver knows exactly how to protect what is vulnerable. Then, I told him that I was no longer the woman who brought roses to a betrayal. I was the woman who owned 83% of his world, and I was coming to collect. I hung up the phone before he could respond. The power balance had officially shifted. For 3 years, I had been the one waiting for him to come home, waiting for updates, waiting for a scrap of his time. Now, he was the one waiting for my next move. I drove back to the house, the gray rain finally beginning to clear, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel like a ghost. I felt like a founder. I felt like the woman my father had trained me to be. The evidence was gathered, the lines were drawn, and the war for Nova Bio had finally begun. I walked into the Nova Bio headquarters on a Tuesday morning in March, and for the first time in 3 years, I did not feel like a guest in my own life. I did not bring roses this time. I brought Terrence, who looked like a storm cloud in a charcoal suit, and Priya, who carried her laptop like a weapon of war. Becca followed behind us, her knuckles white as she gripped the thick black binder that contained 14 months of Austin's lies. We walked down the hallway as a single unit, our footsteps echoing against the stone floors that Austin had installed to replace the linoleum I once loved. The air in the building felt different now, colder and thinner, as if the oxygen was being reserved for those with the right titles. We reached the conference room on the 3rd floor, and I felt a sharp, familiar tug in my chest as I pushed the door open. This was my room. I had picked the oak table. I had designed the layout to ensure every scientist had a view of the harbor. Now, Austin sat at the head of that table, occupying the chair that should have been mine. Noelle sat to his right, her platinum bob perfectly in place, her fingernails painted a deep blood red that matched the rhythm of her fingers tapping against the wood. To Austin's left was Hank Moretti, the independent director who had sold his soul for $85,000. He wouldn't look at me. He kept his eyes fixed on a yellow legal pad, his forehead shiny, with a thin film of sweat. The room smelled heavily of Tom Ford Black Orchid. It was Noelle's scent, a thick, territorial fragrance that seemed to mark every corner of the room as hers. She had clearly sprayed it right before we arrived, an olfactory fence designed to keep me out. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, harsh and unforgiving, illuminating the 6 glasses of water that had been placed on the table. 3 on Austin's side, 3 on mine. It looked like a fair fight, but the air told a different story. Austin adjusted his navy blazer, the light catching the polished face of the Omega Seamaster I had bought him for our 5th anniversary. He looked like a man who believed he had already won. Terrence did not wait for an invitation to sit. He pulled out a chair for me and then sat down, opening a leather folder with a slow, deliberate precision. Carter Webb, the high-priced attorney Austin had hired to protect his stolen kingdom, sat at the opposite end. He was dressed in a Brooks Brothers suit that looked like it cost more than my first 2 patents combined. "We are here to provide formal notice under Article 4, Section 3 of the Nova Bio Articles of Incorporation," Terrence said. His voice was level and dry, the sound of a man who had spent 40 years watching people try to outrun the law. He pushed a document across the table. "All Class B shares issued on October 14 are void from the beginning. My client is exercising her right to a mandatory buyback at par value. That is $1 per share. That clause is unconscionable and completely unenforceable in a modern court," Carter Webb replied. He didn't even look at the paper. "You cannot expect a judge to uphold a penalty that strips millions of dollars in value for a $1 buyback." Terrence leaned forward. "Then we will let a judge decide. But in the meantime, your client issued 200,000 shares without the express written consent of the Class A majority holder. That is not a gray area, Mr. Webb. That is a flagrant violation of the corporate charter. Camilla, please, Austin interrupted. He reached toward me, his face twisting into that practiced boyish look of concern that used to make me melt. Can we just talk? Just the two of us? Without all the lawyers and the drama? I did not look at him. I looked directly at Noelle, who was still tapping her red nails against the table. I was not looking for an apology. I was looking for the woman who thought she could buy my life with a shell company. Miss Reynes, I said. My voice was level, matching Terrence's tone. I mentioned Raines Strategic Partners Limited Liability Company. I mentioned the 4 contracts she had diverted and the $1,400,000 that had disappeared into her accounts. I told her that was not a gray area either. Noelle did not flinch. She did not blink, but the tapping of her nails stopped instantly. The silence in the room became so heavy that I could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Priya began to project our findings onto the wall. A series of flowcharts that turned the betrayal into a bright red map of greed. We showed the payments from Noelle's company to Hank Moretti. Hank's face went from pale to a sickly shade of gray, and he suddenly found it very difficult to breathe. Becca pushed the binder across the table toward Carter Webb. 14 months, she said, just 2 words. But the weight of them landed on the oak table like a brick. She sat back down without another syllable. Carter Webb looked at the binder as if it were a bomb. Austin looked at Noelle, his confidence finally beginning to leak out of his expression. Carter Webb requested a 15-minute recess. When they returned, the air had shifted. Austin looked like a man who had been told his house was on fire. Carter Webb announced that his clients were willing to discuss a structured buyback and a potential realignment of the board. I looked at Terrence. He gave me a nearly imperceptible nod. The math was working. The founder's clause was doing exactly what my father had intended it to do. It was a false victory, a brief moment where I thought the war might end with a signature. Then Noelle spoke for the first time. Her voice was calm, professional, and entirely devoid of heat. Before we discuss any buyback, I want to note for the record that Dr. Yates voluntarily withdrew from all operational roles 3 years ago, Noelle said. She looked me in the eye, her expression as cold as a winter morning. During that period, she signed dozens of digital authorizations. Our position is that her long-term pattern of consent constitutes an implied waiver of the Founder's Clause protections. Carter Webb followed her lead immediately. He stated that they would be filing a motion to invalidate the clause based on unconscionability and implied waiver. Noelle added that they would be requesting the court to examine every single document I had signed in the last 3 years. She said that if even one of those documents authorized an expansion of board authority, my majority rights were effectively gone. My stomach dropped. I remembered the hundreds of emails. I remembered the digital signature boxes I had clicked while sitting in the dark of a hospital room. I remembered the exhaustion that had made the words on the screen look like a blur. I looked at Terrence. He was staring at the table, his fingers tapping 3 times against his folder. It was a nervous tell I had seen in my father 1,000 times. The boardroom meeting ended without a resolution, the brief hope of a quick win vanishing like smoke. We returned to my dining room that night, the house smelling of burnt coffee and the lavender oil I used for Zoe. Terrence and I sat at the table with my laptop, beginning the grueling process of reviewing every single document I had signed since the day Zoe was diagnosed. There were 67 of them. Most were routine, things like insurance renewals or lease extensions for the laboratory equipment. Then we found it. Document number 43. It was titled Board Governance Update, labeled as a routine administrative amendment. It was 6 pages long, buried on page 5. In the middle of a paragraph about meeting schedules was a single sentence. It stated that the board of directors would have the authority to issue additional equity securities as deemed necessary for corporate operations. "I signed this," I whispered. I looked at the date, March 15, at 2:47 in the morning. Terrence looked at the timestamp. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a quiet kind of fury. He asked me what was happening on March 15 of last year. I did not have to check my calendar. I told him that was the week Zoe had a major flare. We were at Massachusetts General Hospital for 4 days. I told him I must have signed it from her bedside while she was sleeping. Terrence took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. He told me that this document was designed to be missed. He said it was 6 pages of boilerplate with one hidden paragraph. He told me it was not negligence. It was fraud. They had sent a material change to the corporate structure at 11 o'clock at night, knowing exactly where I was and what I was facing. But he pointed to another section of the charter. Section 12.1. He reminded me of my father's amendment protection. Any change to the core articles of the company required a 75% supermajority vote of the shareholders. My 83% meant that even if I had clicked a box on a digital form, the amendment never went to a formal shareholder vote. It was procedurally invalid. Austin had been engineering my exit for months, sending me legal traps while texting me that he loved me and hoped Zoe was feeling better. The realization made me feel colder than the hospital room ever had. The stakes were raised 2 days later when Terrence called with news from the court. Judge Kathleen Morse had been assigned to the case, and a hearing was scheduled for March 25. But the private equity fund, Alderton Capital, had been notified of our legal filing and was threatening to walk away from the deal if the dispute was not resolved by the 20th. Austin responded with a company-wide email that Becca forwarded to me within minutes. He told the team that a former shareholder was attempting a hostile takeover of Nova Bio. He claimed it was a personal vendetta and promised everyone that the leadership team was committed to protecting what they had built together. "A former shareholder," Becca said over the phone. Her voice was shaking with anger. "Camilla, you own 83% of this company." I told her to forward the email to me. I took a screenshot and sent it to Terrence. I told him to add it to the evidence of bad faith. Austin was rewriting history in real time, turning the founder into a stranger. But as I looked at the photo of my father on my desk, I knew the one thing Austin did not. You can change a website, and you can change a narrative, but you cannot change the foundation of a house that was built to withstand a storm. I was no longer just fighting for shares. I was fighting for the right to exist in the story I had started. I told Terrence I was ready for the hearing. I was done being a ghost in the building I had built. The following Monday, the momentum we had built began to feel like a house of cards catching a sudden, sharp draft. Terrence had a stack of documents on his desk that looked like a heavy white brick. And he didn't even greet me when I walked in. He just pushed a character declaration across the oak surface. I saw Diane's name at the bottom. And for a second, the room seemed to tilt. Austin's mother had submitted a sworn statement attesting that I had voluntarily abandoned my role and my family. She claimed that during her visits, she observed that I showed no interest in the company and appeared to have moved on from any professional ambitions. I looked at the black ink of her signature and thought about the only 2 times she had actually visited us in 3 years. Once for Zoe's birthday and once for Christmas. And both times, she had spent more time scrolling through her phone than looking at her granddaughter. My throat felt tight, and the air in the office suddenly smelled like old paper and the bitter dregs of Terrence's morning coffee. I told him that she was lying, but he just leaned back and told me that declarations weren't evidence. They were narrative. Still, he said, a judge would read them, and the narrative they were building was one of a mother who had checked out long ago. The attack didn't stop with the family. Carter Webb had also filed a motion to dismiss the founder's clause entirely, calling it unconscionable and an unenforceable penalty. They had also produced a new affidavit from Hank Moretti, where he swore that he had received no improper payments and that the consulting fee was for legitimate work unrelated to his board duties. They were layering their defenses, burying the truth under a mountain of specialized legal jargon. I felt a cold knot forming in my stomach that wouldn't go away. Even after I left the office and stepped into the gray Massachusetts rain, 2 days later, the phone rang while I was in the middle of making Zoe's lunch. It was a reporter from the Boston Globe. He told me he was writing a story about the Nova Bio lawsuit and that Austin's attorney had issued a press statement. He asked if it was true that I was a bitter ex trying to destroy a company my husband had saved. He mentioned that they had quotes from unnamed employees praising Austin's leadership and calling my lawsuit a personal vendetta. I gripped the edge of the counter, my knuckles white against the granite. I told the reporter that I had founded the company in my garage 9 years ago and that I had only stepped back to care for a daughter with lupus. I told him that was the only story there was. But I could tell from his tone that he had already bought into the version Austin was selling. By that afternoon, Becca called me with more bad news. 3 senior employees had resigned because of the uncertainty, including a lead scientist I had personally trained 7 years ago. He had sent an email to the whole team, which Austin had forwarded, saying he wanted to do science and not watch a divorce play out in the hallway. The company was bleeding, and Austin was using the blood to paint me as the villain. Every day he managed to delay the case was another day the company's value eroded. And he was betting that I would break before the company did. On the 18th of March, Carter Webb sent over a settlement offer that was designed to look generous on the surface. Austin would stay on as the chief executive officer. Noel and Hank would resign, and the Class B shares would be canceled. However, they would be replaced by a new structure where Austin held 35% and I held 55%. I would get a seat on the board, but Austin would retain full operational control. Terrence read the terms to me over the phone, and I could hear the skepticism in his voice. He said they were offering me less of what I already owned, while keeping Austin in the chair that mattered. I told him the answer was no. I wasn't going to let them pay me with my own money and tell me I should be grateful for the privilege. The true breaking point came at 4 o'clock in the morning on the 19th. The phone rang on my nightstand, and the sound felt like a physical strike against my chest. It was the babysitter, her voice shaking as she told me that Zoe was running a fever of 103 and that her joints were so swollen she couldn't move her hands. I was at Terrence's office an hour away, preparing for the hearing, and the drive back to the house felt like a fever dream of gray highways and frantic prayers. By the time we got to the emergency room at Massachusetts General, Zoe was pale and shaking, her small body exhausted by the inflammation. The doctor told me it was a severe lupus flare and that they needed to adjust her medication immediately. She would need to stay for observation for at least 3 days, maybe a week. I sat in the hard plastic chair by her bed. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a flat, unforgiving sound. The room smelled of antiseptic, and the faint, sweet scent of the lavender oil I had rubbed into Zoe's temples to help her sleep. Terrence called me at 6 o'clock that morning. He told me the hearing was still scheduled for the 25th, and that if I wasn't there, the judge might rule without me. I looked at Zoe. Her hand was hot and dry in mine, and her breathing was a shallow, ragged sound. I told him that she was in the hospital and that I couldn't leave her. He went quiet for a long time. And then he told me that he would make a motion for a continuance. But he warned me that if they denied it, the consequences would be devastating. Austin showed up at the hospital 2 hours later. He was carrying a stuffed bear and wore an expression of practiced, guilty concern. He tried to tell Zoe that Daddy was there, but she just looked down at her sketchbook and told him that Mom was always there. I watched him flinch, but the guilt didn't last long. He waited until the nurse left the room, and then he lowered his voice, telling me to drop the case for Zoe's sake. He said she needed stability and not a courtroom battle. And then he said the words that finally broke the last string of my patience. He said he had kept the company alive while I was playing nurse. The room went silent, except for the steady, mocking beep of the heart monitor. I felt a heat rising in my face that had nothing to do with the hospital's heater. Playing nurse, 3 years of my life, every sleepless night, every infusion, every moment of fear I had swallowed for my daughter's sake. And he had dismissed it all as a role I was playing. I told him to get out of the room before I said something our daughter shouldn't hear. He left the bear on the bed and walked out. But the insult stayed behind, echoing in the sterile air. I spent the rest of the night watching Zoe sleep. My laptop was open on my lap, but the legal documents were just a blur of white and black. Terrence called at midnight to tell me that the motion for a continuance had been denied. The hearing would proceed on the 25th, with or without me. I looked at Zoe. Her small frame looked so fragile under the heavy hospital blankets. Austin had set a perfect trap. He knew I would never leave her side while she was this sick, and he was using my love for her as a weapon to take everything else I had. I gupped the laptop and held Zoe's hand. I told Terrence that I was staying with my daughter. I had spent my whole life building things. But in that moment, as the hospital monitor beeped in the dark, I realized that some things were worth losing for. I chose her, even if it meant I would lose the building, the patents, and the 83% I had fought so hard to keep. I was a mother first, and Austin had counted on that being my greatest weakness. He had no idea that it was about to become the very thing that destroyed him. The blue light from the heart monitor pulsed in a steady, shivering rhythm against the hospital walls, casting long, thin shadows that seemed to stretch and recoil with every beat. It was 3 o'clock in the morning, that hollow hour when the rest of the world felt like an abandoned stage, and the only reality was the hum of the machines and the recycled air of the pediatric wing. The monitor showed 72 beats per minute, a calm, mechanical baseline that told me my daughter was finally winning the war inside her own body. The inflammation was retreating. I sat in the vinyl chair, the one with the cracked armrests and the faint smell of industrial lemon cleaner, and felt the familiar, dull ache in my lower back that had become my constant companion over the last 3 years. My neck was stiff, and the 3 small scars on my left palm, the ones from the Valentine's Day roses, felt like they were itching in the dry heat of the room. I reached for the sketchbook on the bedside table. Zoe had fallen asleep while drawing, her small fingers still curled around a purple crayon. I opened it to the last page. It was a drawing of 2 figures, one tall and one small, standing hand in front of a building with massive glass windows. She had labeled it me and Mom in her messy, looping script. There was no third person in the picture, no father, no grandmother, just the 2 of us against a world that had spent the last few months trying to edit us out of our own story. I looked at the drawing and then at the glowing screen of my phone. 14 missed calls from him, 3 voicemails I hadn't the stomach to play, and a text from the lab director that had arrived an hour ago. The motion for a continuance had been denied. The hearing would proceed on March 25th, exactly 4 days from now. My heart did a slow, heavy roll in my chest, a cold weight settling in the pit of my stomach. Austin had played his hand perfectly. He knew that as long as our daughter was in this bed, I would be right here next to her, invisible to the court and silent to the board. I leaned my head back against the wall and looked at the acoustic ceiling tiles, counting the tiny holes just as I had during 4 different admissions over the last 3 years. For so long, I had accepted this chair as my assigned seat in the universe. I had believed that being a good mother required a total, quiet erasure of the woman who had founded a biotech company in a garage. My own mother had lived that way, staying home and shrinking herself until there was nothing left but her role as a parent. I had idolized her for that sacrifice. And when Zoe got sick, I had stepped into that same trap with a sense of noble duty. I thought that by sitting here, by letting my patents and my company slide into the hands of thieves, I was finally measuring up to her standard of love. But as I watched the monitor pulse, I realized that my mother hadn't been noble for disappearing. She had just been tired. She had been taught that love was a zero-sum game, that for her children to have a life, she had to give up her own. And he had known that. Austin had counted on me following that old, inherited script of self-sacrifice. He called it playing nurse, but in his mind, it was my permanent retirement. He thought that once I stepped into this room, I would never find the strength to walk back out and claim what was mine. I pulled the envelope from my blazer pocket. The paper was thin and worn at the edges from the dozens of times I had unfolded it since leaving the storage unit. This was the letter my father had left for me. The one I had read 5 times, but hadn't truly understood until this exact moment in the dark. I held it under the dim glow of the reading lamp, my hands finally steady. I skipped past the legal instructions about Article 4 and focused on the last paragraph. He had written that I should never think I had to choose between what I built and the people I loved. He said that my mother had made that choice and that she was wrong. He wrote that he had told her she was wrong every single day, but she wouldn't listen because the world had convinced her otherwise. He called me smarter than her. He told me I would find a way to be both. The words hit me like a physical strike. All this time, I had been fighting to save a company, but I hadn't been fighting to save myself. I had been hiding in this hospital room, using my daughter's illness as a shield against the pain of a broken marriage. Jesus, if I stayed here on the 25th while he lied to a judge, I wasn't being a good mother. I was being a martyr. And Zoe didn't need a martyr. She needed a mother who was whole. She needed to see what it looked like when a woman refused to let the world take what she had built with her own brain and her own 2 hands. The guilt that had been my shadow for 3 years finally began to dissolve, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. I realized that Zoe was stable. She had the best doctors in the state. She had nurses who checked on her every 20 minutes. And she had a babysitter who would sit in this vinyl chair and read her stories for 3 hours. The building, however, was currently being occupied by a man who was trying to burn my legacy to the ground for a private equity payout. I picked up the phone and dialed the lawyer at 3:47 in the morning. He answered on the second ring, his voice alert and gravelly, as if he had been waiting for the call. I told him I would be at the hearing. He didn't ask about the hospital or the risks or the logistics. He simply told me that my father would have said the same thing. I told him I would see him in the morning to finalize the strategy. The next 3 days were a blur of strategic preparation, conducted from a bedside table crowded with juice boxes and medical charts. We worked around the clock to finalize the evidence binder. But we added a new layer that we hadn't considered before the hospital stay. We pulled my medical history and Zoe's admission records from the last 3 years, every emergency room visit and every long-term stay. We began to map those dates against the DocuSign timestamps. The pattern was more than just fraud. It was predatory. Every major corporate change he had pushed through, every contract he had diverted to the shell company, and every amendment he had attempted to hide had been sent to my phone during a medical crisis. Document 43, the one that attempted to waive my consent, had been sent to me at 11 o'clock at night while my daughter was being admitted to the intensive care unit. Document 29 had arrived while I was in a consultation with a specialist about her kidney function. He hadn't just been stealing my shares. He had been timing his thefts to the moments when he knew I was most vulnerable, most distracted, and most desperate. It was a systematic dismantling of corporate ethics conducted in the shadows of a child's sick room. The lab director coordinated with the internal team, gathering sworn statements from the accountant and the head of information technology. They were ready to testify to the irregular invoices and the secret server mirrors that had been created to siphon off our research. We weren't just going to invoke a clause, we were going to expose a criminal conspiracy. I spent my days ensuring my daughter was stable, her fever staying down, and her joints regaining their mobility. The doctors told me she could likely go home the day after the hearing. I kissed her forehead while she napped and told her I would be back before she even woke up. On the morning of March 25th, I stood in the small hospital bathroom and looked at myself in the mirror. I was wearing an old navy blazer, one I hadn't worn since the year we hit our first 10 million in revenue. It was a little tight in the shoulders now, the result of 3 years of lifting a growing child and carrying the weight of a household alone. But it felt like armor. It smelled faintly of mothballs and the starch of a life I had almost forgotten how to live. I tucked my daughter's drawing into my pocket, the one that said, "Go get a mom." The misspelled words were a reminder of why I was doing this. I walked out to the parking lot, the sun rising in a pale, cold yellow over the Boston skyline. I didn't feel like a ghost anymore. I didn't feel like a nurse or a caregiver or a former founder. I felt like the woman who had written a formula on a napkin and turned it into a multi-million-dollar reality. I got into the car and headed toward the courthouse, my hands steady on the wheel. My phone was on the dashboard, and a text from the lawyer appeared. He told me he would see me at 9 o'clock and that my father would be proud. I didn't have to think about my response. I told him that my father was already proud, and that today we were going to finish what he started. I drove past the office building on my way, its glass windows reflecting the morning light like 1,000 tiny mirrors. He thought he had won because he knew I would always choose my daughter. He was right about that, but what he didn't know was that by choosing her, I was finally choosing to fight for the world she was going to inherit. I turned the corner toward the courthouse, the engine humming a steady, determined note against the quiet of the morning, ready to face the reckoning. The Suffolk County Superior Courtroom 4B was smaller than I expected. It did not have the grand, mahogany columns or the vaulted ceilings I had seen in movies. Instead, it was a rectangular room that smelled of old paper, industrial furniture polish, and the faint, dusty scent of a building that had seen too much human misery. The air was thick and dry, the kind of atmosphere that seemed to pull the moisture right out of your throat. I sat at the petitioner's table, my hands resting on a cold metal surface that had been worn smooth by decades of nervous palms. I could feel the crinkle of the drawing in my blazer pocket, the one Zoe had made for me that morning, and the starch of my old navy blazer felt like a protective shell. Across the aisle, Austin sat with his head bowed, his fingers perpetually twisting the crown of his Omega Seamaster watch. He looked smaller in this light, stripped of the motivational buzzwords and the bright LED lights of the Nova Bio lobby. Noelle sat beside her own attorney, her platinum blonde bob perfectly still. She had opted for no fragrance today, a tactical move that told me she knew Judge Kathleen Morse had no patience for territorial marking. Hank Moretti sat 2 rows behind them, his face the color of wet parchment and his collar looking 2 sizes too small for his neck. Judge Morse entered the room with a brisk, no-nonsense energy. She was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and reading glasses perched precariously on the tip of her nose. She did not look like someone who believed in coincidences. Terrence stood first, his voice gravelly but steady as he presented the original Articles of Incorporation from 2017. He moved through the legal framework with the precision of a surgeon, laying out the founder's clause and the failure of the board to conduct a proper shareholder vote for the share dilution. Carter Webb tried to argue that the clause was an unconscionable penalty, but Judge Morse cut him off before he could finish the sentence. She told him that a founder protecting her own company from unauthorized dilution was not shocking to the conscience of the court. It was prudent. She told him to move on to the facts. Priya Nair took the witness stand next. She moved through the financial exhibits with a quiet, devastating efficiency. The projector on the wall displayed the flowchart we had spent weeks building red lines connecting Nova Bio to Rain's Strategic Partners Limited Liability Company. When the slide showed the $85,000 payment to Hank Moretti, the silence in the room became absolute. Judge Morse looked over her glasses at the independent director, and I saw Hank's hands begin to shake. She asked if he would like to revise his sworn statement before she referred the matter to the district attorney for perjury. Hank's lawyer stood up to intervene, but the damage was done. The most jarring moment came when Priya displayed the invoice for the $3,200 executive cohesion workshop in Napa Valley. A few law clerks in the back of the room suppressed a laugh. But I did not find it funny. I watched the back of Austin's neck turn a deep, shameful red. Carter Webb attempted a sidebar, but Judge Morse denied it, stating that the court was in open session. Then came the final exhibit. Terrence called it Exhibit D. Priya projected a timeline that showed my daughter's hospital admissions on the left and the DocuSign timestamps on the right. The overlap was perfect. Every major corporate theft had been timed to a medical emergency. Terrence argued that this was not a case of implied waiver or consent. It was a case of exploitation. He told the court that Austin Yates had waited until I was at my daughter's bedside to steal her future. Judge Morse removed her glasses and looked directly at Austin. There was a long, heavy pause that felt like it lasted a lifetime. She announced that she had heard enough and that the court would reconvene at 2:15 for her ruling. She suggested that Mr. Yates use the lunch recess to reconsider his position. When the clock hit 2:15, the room felt even tighter than before. Noelle was conspicuously absent. Her chair sat empty, and her attorney looked as if she were preparing for a funeral. Austin sat alone, his hands gripped together in his lap. Judge Morse did not waste time. She stated that this was a preliminary injunction hearing, not a final trial. But the evidence before her was more than sufficient to act. She found that the petitioner had demonstrated a clear likelihood of success on the merits regarding the Founders Clause. She declared it facially valid, unambiguous, and enforceable. She ruled that the Section 7.2 amendment had never gone to a proper shareholder vote as required by Section 12.1, and was therefore procedurally void. She enjoined the exercise of all Class B shares pending final adjudication, and ordered a mandatory buyback of $200,000 to be placed in escrow within 30 days. She found sufficient preliminary evidence of fiduciary breach by Austin Yates and Hank Moretti and referred the matters of fraud and perjury to the district attorney. She then removed Austin Yates from his position as chief executive officer, effective immediately, pending the resolution of the underlying case. The 83% shareholder, she said, would designate interim leadership. She noted with grave concern the pattern of timing critical documents to a minor child's hospital stays. She told Austin that while the divorce was not before her today, his conduct would certainly be relevant in any subsequent proceedings. Austin did not look up. He sat there, a man who had tried to build a kingdom on the back of a sick child's mother, and watched it all crumble into a $200,000 buyback. The following morning, I walked into the third-floor office of Nova Bio. I did not wear roses, and I did not look for a banner. Becca had arranged the chairs in a large circle in the open office, a configuration that suggested a conversation rather than a lecture. 37 employees sat in those chairs, some of whom had only known the version of the story Austin had told them. I stood in the center of the circle, my blazer shoulders still feeling a little tight, and I told them the truth. I told them my name was Dr. Camilla Yates, and that I had started this company in a garage with $40,000 and a formula on a napkin. I told them I had stepped back to care for my daughter, and I explained exactly what had happened while I was gone. I did not use the word affair. I did not mention Noelle by name. I simply spoke about the numbers, the contracts, and the trust that had been broken. When I told them that I had signed documents from a hospital room at 3 in the morning because I believed in the person who sent them, Jenny, from accounting, began to cry. The room was not filled with the fake, loud cheers of a month ago. It was filled with a quiet, earned respect. I told them I was back, not for revenge, but because this building was mine and I wanted to keep building with them. Becca was the first to clap, her hands hitting together with a fierce, rhythmic sound. And soon, the whole room followed. By 6 o'clock that evening, I was finally alone in my office. The locks had been changed back, and the air smelled of fresh white paint. Becca had spent the day helping me scrub the Tom Ford black orchid out of the room. I sat in my chair and looked out the large glass windows at the Boston skyline. The sun was setting, painting the harbor in deep oranges and purples. I looked at the wall behind my desk. I had framed 2 things and hung them side by side. On the left was the letter my father had written to me in the storage unit, a reminder that I was smart enough to be both a mother and a founder. On the right was the drawing Zoe had made for me the morning of the hearing, 2 figures, one tall and one small, standing in front of a building with massive glass windows, the sun drawn in thick yellow crayon behind the roof. Across the bottom, in her messy, looping handwriting, she had written, "Go get 'em, Mom." She had misspelled them, leaving out the TH, but the message was the clearest thing anyone had said to me in months. My phone buzzed on the desk. It was a FaceTime call from Zoe. I answered it, and her bright, pale face filled the screen. She told me the doctor said she could finally go home. She asked if we could get pizza and if we could eat it at my building so she could see the big windows. I looked at the skyline and then back at my daughter. I told her yes. I told her we would eat pizza right here in the room with the big windows. I stood up and grabbed my coat, passing the hook where my lab coat would hang starting next Monday. I realized then that my father had been right. I did not have to choose. The building did not take away from the mother, and the mother did not take away from the founder. They were 2 halves of the same whole, and they were both finally home. The sensor on the door clicked as I stepped out, and the lights of the office stayed on behind me, a steady glow in the coming dark. I was no longer a ghost in my own history. I was the one holding the pen, and the next chapter was finally mine to write.